Welcome everyone to part 6 of module 9, which is social psychology. Today what we're going to be looking at is attraction. So the first thing we're going to talk about is interpersonal attraction. So this is a really wide definition, and I think this is really important because a lot of times when we talk about attraction, we only tend to think of one kind, which is kind of like romantic or sexual attraction. But the reality is attraction is very broad. So when we're talking about interpersonal attraction, is all of the forces that lead people to like each other, establish relationships, and in some cases fall in love. Okay, there are a lot of different forms though of attraction or of interpersonal attraction. So these forms can be liking somebody, loving someone, it can be friendship, it can be lust, it can even be admiration as a type of interpersonal attraction. All attraction really are these forces that lead people to kind of fall into one of these kind of categories, right? To like somebody, to have a relationship with somebody, in some cases fall in love with people, right? So we can kind of see how there's this really broad grouping here, right? So your friend, like you have an attraction to your friends. It might not be a sexual attraction, but you are attracted to, their personality, how they act, the things they do. You might admire them in some cases, right? That is a form of attraction. It's just not the same form that maybe you have on your crush or maybe you have on the person you've been dating, right? But it all is still kind of wrapped up, at least psychologically speaking, in this idea of attraction. From there, we're going to talk about some of the different kind of things that affect attraction. So the psychology of attraction. What are the things that make people attracted to each other? Okay. So one of the big ones is proximity, right? Proximity is literally how physically close you are to that person, right? So are you near them frequently? Right? And what we actually see is that the more likely the more close they are frequently, the more close they are physically, the more likely they are to form a relationship, right? Whether that's friendship or, a romantic relationship. So this is why, for example, a lot of times the people you end up being friends with are people that you're in class with, or you go to school with, or they're your neighbors, or they're on a sports team and you're, around them a lot. Or the people you end up dating are again people are in class with, or people you are nearby a lot, or they live near you, or they're part of a group that you're a part of, right? They are literally in their proximity, right? You are just literally physically near them. And again, when we're physically near people, it makes it much more likely that we will form some sort of relationship with them. The next piece is familiarity. So familiarity can also be called the mere exposure effect. What this basically is that when we have repeated exposure to something, we're going to call it a novel stimulus, right? So something new, it increases our likely of that thing. So when there's something and I expose you to it over and over again, it increases how much you like that thing. Same thing goes for people, right? So when there's a person and you're exposed to them over and over again, so for example, you have a class with them and you sit next to them at your table. So every day you go to school, you sit next to them and you see them and you interact with them. That increases how much you like that person, right? It increases that aspect. We tend to like things that are familiar. So again, when we're becoming familiar with somebody, when we are exposed to them again and again, we tend to like them more and more. The things that are familiar, and this is this last piece there, things that are familiar produce more positive feelings and they feel safer, right? Obviously, you can imagine how these pieces connect to attraction. The next thing we'll talk about is physical attractiveness. So physical attractiveness is one of the best predictors of attractiveness, right? So if we wanted to know what makes people attractive, physical attractiveness tends to be the best predictor. Now, physical attractiveness can go a bit beyond like the literal physical traits you have. One thing we see is that our feelings do influence it, how attractive we perceive others to be. So when you are, let's say, like in a relationship with someone and you are closer and closer, right, you might find them more and more physically attractive. Now, if that relationship ends, maybe it ends really badly, you might look at that person afterwards and kind of not find them very attractive anymore, even though physically they haven't really changed, right? So our feelings do have an impact on physical attractiveness outside of just, the literal physical features of that person. Now, when we want to talk about physical attractiveness, there are obviously beauty standards that we kind of have, but those standards do vary from culture to culture and throughout time. So, what it meant to be really, really attractive if you were living in 18th century Europe looks different than it does today. What it means to be attractive if you live in Japan looks different than in the US, or if you live in South Africa, looks different than, in Australia, right? So we are going to see differences here as we kind of compare cultures, as we compare time periods. But there are some constant things that we see. So, for example, men tend to prefer a youthful appearance. So that's something we kind of see pretty much constantly across the board. Doesn't matter the time period, doesn't matter the culture. Men tend to prefer a youthful appearance. Women, on the other hand, tend to prefer mature, dominant, masculine, and affluent-looking men. So we can kind of, again, see those differences. These are already things we talked about earlier when we were talking about the evolutionary perspective, why these could be possibilities. Obviously, there can be social factors as well, but we can obviously think of the evolutionary reasons why this might be the case as well. We also see a constant idea that faces are more important than figure. So what that means is having a pretty face, a physically attractive face, can kind of, I don't know if I want to say outweigh, but has a bigger impact on your overall attractiveness than your body does, right? So faces tend to be more important than the physical figure of a person. We also know that there are some facial features that are kind of constantly considered attractive. So faces that are symmetrical is a really important aspect. So if you draw a line down the middle, right, do the left and the right side of your face look the same? So having a symmetry in your face is an important factor, as well as being more average, right? So what I mean by average here isn't like average looking, but it's having average features. So eyes that aren't too big, but also not too small, right? They're average. Noses that aren't too big but aren't too small, right? But average. Lips that aren't too big or too small, but average, right? So average faces tend to be considered the most attractive. And there's actually an experiment that's kind of interesting they did where they took a whole bunch of people's faces and they had people basically like rank them on attractiveness, but then they made a face out of composite. So basically they took a whole bunch of faces and composite them all together into one person, right? Now, obviously, when you do that, you're creating a super average person, right? If it's a combination of everybody else, then they're going to end up being very much in the middle of everybody. And that face scores really, really high pretty much across the board, right? So again, we can kind of see how having this symmetrical average features is attractive regardless, again, of culture, regardless of time. Those kind of tend to be constant. The next thing we have when we're talking about the psychology of attraction is similarity. So this is actually kind of an interesting one because a lot of times people tend to think the opposite, or at least it's like a little saying, right? But the reality is the more similar two people are in attitudes, backgrounds, traits, even physical attractiveness, the more probable it is that they will like each other, okay? There's kind of this idea that opposites attract. I'm sure a lot of people have heard that saying before, opposites attract. The reality is that's not true at all. Opposites do not attract each other. Similarities attract people. And we tend to see this. Now, again, we could talk about this in romantic relationships, but also in friendships, right? We tend to prefer people that are similar to us. So we tend to like people that are similar age, similar level of education, similar racially, similar religiously, have similar level of intelligence, are socioeconomically similar. All of those things tend to be things that are preferable to us, right? Now, this doesn't mean that the person, you end up with in life, the person you marry or have a long-term relationship with is going to be the exact same person of you, right? It just means that they're going to be similar to you in a lot of ways, right? And kind of a really simple example of this is it's not very likely that you're going to have a really successful relationship. Let's say if you are a PhD and the person you're with didn't graduate high school, right? Probably not very likely that's gonna cause attraction, right? Or if you're an incredibly wealthy person, and this other person is living in abstract poverty, right? Abject poverty, right? It's not very likely that that's going to cause attraction. So again, doesn't mean that you're going to be exactly the same, but we tend to see, right, similarities. People that are more similar tend to be more attracted to each other. And again, it's overall similar. It's not every little thing. So the next piece we're going to talk about are Sternbergs Components of Love. So this is looking at specifically at romantic love, not necessarily just all relationships. The other pieces we're just looking at attraction in general. So attraction in general is both romantic attraction as well as just friendships and general attraction. Romantic love is obviously going to focus on romance and love. So Sternberg broke down love into 3 components: intimacy, passion, and commitment. So we're going to look at basically each of these pieces here. There we go. So our first piece is intimacy, and you can kind of see it on this little triangle here at the top. So intimacy is the feelings of emotional closeness that one has for another person. Intimacy is often connected with friendship, right? When you have a really good friend, you probably share a level of intimacy, right? You are emotionally close to one another. We also have passion. Passion is the more physical aspects of love. So it's also emotional, but the emotional and sexual arousal a person feels towards another person, right? So when we are just have passion, we tend to be infatuated with someone, right? So if you have somebody that you're infatuated with, right, it might be like this really passionate crush that you have on someone would be like an example of passion and infatuation. Then we also have commitment, right? So commitment are the decisions and promise to sustain a relationship. Now, when you just have commitment, we have what is called empty love, which is where there's no intimacy and there's no passion, but you're still committed to that person, right? We don't really tend to see this a lot, but that's what it would be, right? So you can again see all of these components. All of these components can technically be on their own. So like you can just have intimacy with someone, but that would just be, liking somebody. We don't think of that usually as romantic. We can have just passion, which is just infatuation, right? Where there's not any intimacy, there's not closeness, there's not commitment, but we're just really infatuated with this person. We're really passionate about them. And we have commitment, which again we just kind of went over. Now we also can look at the combinations of these, right? So the first one we'll look at is fatuous love or passionate. So this is an aroused state of intense positive absorption in another person. We usually see fatuous love at the beginning of relationships. So sometimes it's also referred to as like the honeymoon period, right? So when you first start, let's say you first start a relationship with somebody, you probably feel this fatuous love, right? You're really committed to them. You feel really passionately about them, right? You want to be with them all the time. You think about them all the time, right? That's this fatuous love that we have. Again, a combination of commitment and passion. Next, we have companionate love. You can see it on the right side there. So companionate love is a combination of, I'm sorry, I was kind of reading 2 different things at once. It's a combination of intimacy and of commitment, right? So intimacy and commitment. Now, a lot of times when we see companionate love, it is when we've had passionate love that is kind of cooled. So this is kind of post-honeymoon period, right? So we have this relationship, right? We go through our honeymoon period, right, where we're incredibly absorbed in one another, but eventually that kind of passion kind of cools down a bit, right? And then we get into what's called companionate love. Now, this is where we have kind of this more warm, enduring love between the people. This is what we're often going to see in like long-term relationships, right? So, for example, like if you were to be around like an elderly couple that have been married for 50 years or something like that. That's maybe a little bit of a stretch, but like 20 or 30 or 40 years, right? They've been together for a really long time. They probably show companionate love, right? It maybe not isn't quite as like passionate as maybe it was when they were younger. It can be, but maybe it's not. But there's this really warm, enduring kind of partnership this connection that they have. It's very, very intimate and very committed. The last piece we're looking at, we're kind of skipping romantic love just because they don't really cover it specifically in what we want, is consummate love. So consummate love is kind of like the ideal. This is the most complete, most ideal form of love. This is what we want to aim for. What it is where we have this love relationship that is intimate, passionate, and committed. Okay, so we have all three. And this is kind of, again, the goal, generally speaking, of what people want, right? This is the ideal form. So we've got all aspects. We are close and intimate to one another. We are incredibly committed to one another. But we are also still passionate about each other, right? And that's kind of the end goal that we want. So this is going to wrap up our look at attraction. Please, again, take a few moments, do a short summary, and I will see you guys next time.